Denise Williams. For 17 years, the official story in Tallahassee, Florida, was that Mike Williams had drowned while duck hunting on Lake Seminole, and that alligators had consumed his body. His mother never believed it. His best friend helped collect the life insurance. So how does a man vanish on a lake in December of 2000? Only for the truth to surface nearly 2 decades later, because the people closest to him turned on each other. Nobody was paying attention to what was happening between Mike Williams, his wife Denise, and his best friend Brian Winchester back in 1997. On the surface, all three of them were part of the same social circle in Tallahassee. Mike and Brian had grown up together. Mike and Denise were married with a young daughter. Brian sold life insurance for a living. It looked like an ordinary group of friends building ordinary lives. But behind that, Denise and Brian had begun an affair. According to Winchester's later statements to investigators, Denise initiated it and made clear that she did not believe in divorce. Winchester, who had professional access to insurance products, encouraged Mike to take out a $1 million life insurance policy in the months leading up to what happened next. On December 16, 2000, Mike Williams went duck hunting alone on Lake Seminole. He never came home. The initial theory was drowning followed by alligator predation, and for a while that held. But when his hunting waders and jacket were recovered 6 months later, they showed no teeth marks, no animal DNA, and no significant weathering. If an alligator had taken him, the gear would have shown it. A Leon County judge issued a presumptive death certificate after just 6 months, when the typical process takes 5 years. Denise collected approximately $1.5 million in insurance proceeds. She and Winchester continued their relationship. For years, 2 people refused to let the story end there. Mike's mother, Cheryl Williams, fought in court to prevent the premature death certificate and continued pressing for a criminal investigation when she lost that battle. Reporter Jennifer Portman of the Tallahassee Democrat kept the case in the public eye for 17 years, publishing stories that challenged the drowning theory and pressured investigators to take a second look. The case might have stayed closed forever if Winchester's paranoia had not consumed him. In August of 2016, he kidnapped Denise at gunpoint. Convinced she was about to turn him in, he was arrested and sentenced to 20 years for that crime alone. Then, in 2017, Winchester made a deal. In exchange for immunity on the homicide charge, he led the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to Mike's remains near Carr Lake, roughly 50 miles from where search teams had spent years looking. The body had been buried in a wooded area off Gardner Road for 17 years. He confessed that he had lured Mike onto the boat, pushed him overboard, and then shot him in the head when Mike resurfaced. Denise Williams was arrested on May 8, 2018. The date fell on her daughter Ansley's 19th birthday. She was indicted on first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and accessory after the fact. At trial in December 2018 before Leon County Circuit Judge James C. Hankinson, prosecutor John Fuchs built the case largely around Winchester's testimony. The jury convicted on all counts after 8 hours of deliberation. In January 2019, the judge sentenced her to life, plus 30 years. The appeals process reshaped part of that outcome. In November 2020, Florida's First District Court of Appeal vacated the murder conviction, finding insufficient evidence that Denise had directly aided the act itself, but upheld the conspiracy conviction. On September 9, 2021, she was resentenced by Judge Kevin Carroll to the maximum 30 years on the conspiracy charge. As of September 2025, Denise Williams is imprisoned at the Florida Women's Reception Center in Ocala. She is 55 years old. Brian Winchester is serving 20 years at Wakulla Correctional Institution for the kidnapping. Their daughter Ance Lee received the insurance proceeds. Sometimes the evidence that cracks a case wide open is not a fingerprint or a strand of DNA. Sometimes it is testimony from someone who already knows where the body's buried. And in the case of Michael Peterson in Durham, North Carolina, the evidence that unraveled everything came from a forensic analyst whose own credibility would eventually collapse under the weight of a statewide scandal. Michael Peterson. On the night of December 9, 2001, novelist and former Durham mayoral candidate Michael Peterson called 911 to report that he had found his wife Kathleen at the bottom of the back staircase of their Forest Hills mansion, lying in a pool of blood. She was a Nortel Networks executive, a mother, and by all accounts, a driven professional. The autopsy conducted by Dr. Deborah Radish documented 7 deep lacerations to her scalp. How does a woman sustain 7 lacerations to the head from a staircase fall? That question drove the entire prosecution. Assistant DA Frida Black and DA James Harden argued that Michael Peterson had a secret he was desperate to protect. His computer contained emails to and exchanges with a Raleigh area male escort named Brent Walgamot, along with explicit material that, according to the state, Kathleen had discovered. Walgamot testified at trial that while Peterson had contacted him, they had never actually met in person. The prosecution's theory was that a confrontation over these discoveries led to a violent argument that ended at the bottom of those stairs. Kathleen, the state argued, had found the emails that night, and Michael could not let the truth come out. At trial in 2003, SBI agent Dwayne Deaver provided extensive blood spatter testimony, arguing the patterns on the walls and staircase were inconsistent with an accidental fall. Deaver had worked at the State Bureau of Investigation for over a decade and presented himself as one of the state's foremost blood spatter experts. The defense, led by David Rudolph, countered with its own expert, one Dr. Henry Lee, who famously demonstrated how coughing could produce similar spatter patterns using ketchup in the courtroom. The jury was not convinced by the defense. On October 10, 2003, they convicted Michael Peterson of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life without parole. For 8 years, that verdict stood. And then everything Deaver had testified to began falling apart. An independent audit ordered by North Carolina Attorney General Roy Cooper, first reported by the News and Observer in August 2010, found that Deaver had been personally tied to falsified evidence in 34 cases. That's not a typo, by the way. 34. The broader audit called into question 230 criminal cases spanning 16 years of Deaver's career at the SBI. He was fired in January 2011. By December of that year, Judge Orlando Hudson granted Peterson a new trial based on the tainted testimony. Peterson was released on bond and house arrest. Meanwhile, a defense neighbor named Larry Pollard advanced what became known as the owl theory, pointing to microscopic feather fragments found in Kathleen's hair as evidence that a barred owl had attacked her before the fall. The state's pathologist, Dr. Radish, publicly disputed it, and no court ever adopted it as the basis for a ruling. But the theory became one of the most widely discussed elements of the case in true crime circles. Rather than face a retrial with much of the original evidence now inadmissible, Peterson entered an Alford plea to voluntary manslaughter on February 24, 2017. An Alford plea means the defendant maintains their innocence, while acknowledging the prosecution has enough evidence to likely secure a conviction. Prosecutor Jim Dornfried noted at the time that Deaver's testimony and key computer evidence would no longer be admissible. which significantly weakened the state's case at retrial. Judge Hudson sentenced Peterson to 64 to 86 months, less time than the 98.5 months he had already served. He walked out of the courtroom that day, though legally he remains a convicted felon. He has never been exonerated. As of 2026, Michael Peterson is 82 years old, living in a two-bedroom apartment in Durham. He published 2 memoirs, Behind the Staircase and Beyond the Staircase, in 2019, donating proceeds to charity. He has stated publicly and repeatedly that he did not take Kathleen's life. The case remains the subject of the 2004 French documentary, The Staircase, directed by Jean-Xavier de Lestrade, and a 2022 HBO Max dramatization starring Colin Firth as Peterson. Kathleen Peterson's family has never publicly accepted the Alford plea as a resolution. Not every affair plays out over years of secrecy and slow-burning manipulation. In the next case, 2 soldiers stationed at the same army base carried out a plan so rushed and reckless that it unraveled within days. Kamia Hassel. On New Year's Eve 2018, Army Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III stepped outside his father's home in St. Joseph Township, Michigan, to pick up food for the family. He was 23 years old, a soldier with the 1st Armored Brigade Combat Team, 3rd Infantry Division, stationed at Fort Stewart, Georgia. He was home on holiday leave with his wife Kamia and their young son. It was about 11 at night. Fireworks were going off across the neighborhood. When he returned to the driveway, someone was waiting for him in the dark. Specialist Jeremy Cuellar, a 24-year-old fellow soldier from the same unit, ambushed Tyrone and shot him multiple times. Kamia, who was inside the house, called 911 sounding distraught. Tyrone was struck by multiple rounds and did not survive. He was pronounced dead from gunshot wounds. To the officers who responded, it initially looked like it could have been a random act of violence on a chaotic holiday night. So why would a fellow soldier drive hundreds of miles to take the life of a man in his own family's driveway? The answer traces back to a deployment in South Korea, where Kamia and Cuellar had begun an affair. Cuellar was also married at the time. Fellow soldiers had noticed the relationship openly, and their behavior drew attention on base. Tyrone reportedly knew about the affair, but had not confronted his wife directly. What investigators would later establish was that Kamia and Cuellar had devised a plan to end Tyrone's life, collect approximately $400,000 in military death benefits and service members' group life insurance, and then relocate together to Georgia with Kamia's son. Officer Jeremy Peppers of the St. Joseph Township Police Department and Special Agent Zachary Roberts of Army CID led the investigation. The break came quickly. Anonymous tips and 2 fellow soldiers, including Specialist Jaquan Hamilton, reported their suspicions to Army CID at Fort Stewart. Digital evidence proved critical. Snapchat messages and cell phone text records placed Cuellar in Michigan for 4 separate trips between December 19th and December 31st. The pattern of travel made it clear this was not a spontaneous visit. Cuellar confessed first. Kamia confessed after failing a polygraph and was arrested on January 12, 2019, the same day as her husband's funeral. The trial took place in July 2019 in Berrien County before Circuit Judge Angela Pasula. Chief Assistant Prosecutor Steve Pierangeli presented the state's case, walking the jury through the digital trail that connected Kamia to Cuellar's travel, their communications about the insurance payout, and the timeline of events on the night Tyrone was ambushed. Defense attorney Chris Kessel argued on Kamia's behalf, but the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for roughly 1 hour before convicting Kemia on first-degree premeditated murder as an aider and abettor, along with conspiracy to commit first-degree premeditated murder. On August 29, 2019, Judge Pasula sentenced Kemia Hassel to mandatory life without parole on the murder count, plus life with the possibility of parole on the conspiracy count. The mandatory sentence on the primary charge controls, meaning she will not be eligible for release. Jeremy Quillar pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received 65 to 90 years. From the affair's beginning in South Korea to the sentencing in Michigan, the entire arc of this case played out among soldiers who had served side by side. In 2022, Kemia petitioned for a new trial, arguing ineffective assistance of counsel because her defense team had not raised battered woman syndrome evidence. The Michigan Court of Appeals denied the petition. Tyrone's father publicly disputed any history of domestic violence, saying his son had never harmed Kemia. The entire case, from the night of the shooting to the final denial of appeal, underscored how quickly a military family's life could be destroyed by the people closest to the victim. Tyrone Hassel III was 23 years old when he stepped into that driveway, and the two people most responsible for his death were the two people he had trusted the most. As of 2026, Kemia Hassel remains incarcerated at Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Pittsfield Charter Township, Michigan. The Hassel case moved fast, from crime to conviction in roughly 7 months. But the next case sat unsolved for months, and the evidence that finally cracked it did not come from a witness, a lab, or a detective. It came from a dead man's briefcase. Shari Miller. In February of 2000, a man named Jerry Cassidy ended his own life in Reno, Nevada. Before he did, he placed a briefcase under his bed. Inside were printed emails, hotel receipts, airline tickets, IM chat logs, and a handwritten note addressed to his parents. The note described in detail how he had driven to Michigan and taken the life of a man named Bruce Miller, and it named the person who had helped set it up. The clock on this story starts in April 1999, when Shari Miller married Bruce Miller, the owner of an auto salvage yard in Mount Morris, Michigan. 3 months into their marriage, Shari attended a Mary Kay convention at Harrah's Casino in Reno, where she met Jerry Cassidy. Cassidy was a former Kansas City area homicide detective who had moved into casino work as a pit boss. They began an affair conducted almost entirely online through AOL chat and email. Over the following months, Shari sent Cassidy explicit photographs and fabricated 2 pregnancies, despite having undergone a 2-ball ligation in 1995. She told Cassidy that Bruce had beaten her into losing both pregnancies and that he had connections to organized crime. And no, none of that was true. Cassidy, a former homicide detective who should have been skeptical of everything, believed all of it. The manipulation played on his protective instincts and his romantic attachment. And Shari maintained the deception entirely through digital communication, rarely meeting Cassidy in person. On November 8, 1999, Cassidy drove roughly 800 miles from Missouri to Mount Morris, Michigan, and shot Bruce Miller with a 20-gauge shotgun at his auto salvage workplace. Bruce was found by employees. The initial investigation focused on another employee, John Hutchinson, who had borrowed money from Bruce and showed deception on a polygraph. But no charges were filed, and the case went cold for months. Then Cassidy's brother Mike discovered the briefcase. He found it under the bed while going through Jerry's belongings after the death. The contents laid out a paper trail connecting Shari and Jerry across months of planning, travel, and communication. Printed emails, hotel receipts from trips to Michigan, airline tickets tracking Cassaday's movements, and the handwritten note addressed to his parents, naming Cherie directly. It was a confession and an accusation at the same time, delivered from beyond the grave. Mike Cassaday turned the briefcase over to law enforcement. Cherie Miller was arrested in February 2000. Her trial ran from December 12th through the 22nd, 2000, in Genesee County Circuit Court before Judge Judith Fullerton. Prosecutor Mark Baxt, later joined by future county prosecutor David Layton, presented the state's case. The jury convicted on second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. On January 29, 2001, the judge sentenced her to life in prison on the conspiracy count, plus 54 to 81 years on the second-degree murder charge. The appeals process stretched over more than a decade. In August 2008, U.S. District Judge Victoria Roberts overturned the conviction, ruling that Cassaday's suicide note violated the Confrontation Clause under Crawford v. Washington because the defense could never cross-examine him. Cherie was released on bond in July 2009 and immediately rearrested. The case bounced through the Sixth Circuit and was remanded by the U.S. Supreme Court. In August 2012, the District Court reinstated the convictions under the older Ohio v. Roberts framework, and the Sixth Circuit affirmed that in February 2014. In 2016, while still in prison, Cherie wrote a 4-page letter to Judge Fullerton confessing to her involvement. In August 2017, Fullerton denied her motion for relief from judgment. Cherie also married fellow inmate Michael DeNoyer in 2008 while incarcerated. As of 2024, Cherie Miller remains at Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Michigan, serving her life sentence. Cherie Miller manipulated one man into taking the life of another, and it might have worked if the man she manipulated had not left behind a paper trail. In the next case, the suspect was not just someone close to the victim. He was a police sergeant in the same town, and getting anyone to investigate him would take years, a second autopsy, and a law written specifically for his case. Drew Peterson. On March 1, 2004, a woman named Kathleen Savio was found in her home in Bolingbrook, Illinois, lying face down in a dry bathtub with a gash on the back of her head and bruises consistent with a struggle. She was in the middle of a contentious divorce from her husband, a Bolingbrook police sergeant named Drew Peterson. The financial settlement was still pending. Her death was initially ruled an accidental drowning. 3 years later, on October 28, 2007, Drew Peterson's fourth wife, Stacy Peterson, disappeared. Drew told police she had run off with another man. She has never been found and is presumed deceased. Drew remains the sole person of interest in her disappearance, though he has never been charged. When Stacy vanished, the public attention swung back to Kathleen Savio's death. The Will County State's Attorney, James Glasgow, ordered her body exhumed for a second autopsy. Pathologists Dr. Larry Blum and Dr. Michael Bodden examined the remains and concluded that Savio's death was a homicide staged to look like an accidental fall. The original scene had been processed by the Bolingbrook Police Department, the same department where Drew Peterson held the rank of sergeant. The manner of death was officially reclassified from accidental to homicide. The investigation faced a significant and unusual obstacle. Both of the women who could directly implicate Drew Peterson were unavailable as witnesses. Kathleen was dead. Stacy was missing and presumed deceased. But both had made statements to people they trusted before they became unavailable. Stacy had confided in her pastor, Reverend Neil Shorey, about what Drew had told her regarding Kathleen's death. Kathleen had spoken to her divorce attorney, Harry Smith, about her fear that Drew would take her life. Under normal rules of evidence, those out-of-court statements would be inadmissible hearsay. In 2008, the Illinois legislature passed what the press called Drew's Law, formerly 725 ILCS 5, Section 115-10.6. The law codified the common law doctrine of forfeiture by wrongdoing. If a defendant is shown to have caused a witness's unavailability, their prior statements can be admitted. Both Reverend Shorey and Attorney Smith were permitted to testify at trial. The affair pattern that ran through Drew Peterson's life is worth noting. He met and began a relationship with Kathleen Savio while still married to his second wife, Vicki Connolly. He then began pursuing Stacy Kales while still married to Savio. Stacy was a teenager at the time. Each new relationship overlapped with the dissolution, or worse, of the previous one. By the time Stacy disappeared, Drew had cycled through 4 marriages, and 2 of those wives had either died or vanished under circumstances that pointed directly back to him. Drew Peterson's trial concluded on September 6, 2012, with a conviction on first-degree murder in the death of Kathleen Savio. On February 21, 2013, Judge Edward Burmilla sentenced him to 38 years. A man already serving 38 years for taking 1 life, then tried to arrange the death of the prosecutor who put him there. In 2014, a fellow inmate at Menard Correctional Center wore a wire and recorded Peterson attempting to hire someone to take the life of prosecutor James Glasgow. Peterson was convicted on May 31, 2016, and sentenced on July 29, 2016, to an additional 40 years to be served consecutively. The Illinois Supreme Court upheld the original conviction on September 21, 2017, ruling that the forfeiture by wrongdoing doctrine survived a Sixth Amendment challenge because the evidence supported the finding that Peterson had caused the witnesses' unavailability specifically to silence them. Peterson filed a handwritten post-conviction petition in October 2021, alleging ineffective assistance of counsel and prosecutorial witness intimidation. His original defense attorney, Joel Brodsky, was later held in contempt for a gag order violation related to public statements about the case. In February 2024, Peterson appeared in court in person for the first time in roughly 7 years before Judge Dave Carlson, who ordered a mental fitness evaluation. Later that year, Judge Carlson denied a second fitness evaluation after noting that Peterson had participated lucidly in a national television interview just months earlier. As of 2026, Drew Peterson is reported to be incarcerated at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, Indiana, under the Interstate Corrections Compact. The Illinois Department of Corrections retains jurisdiction, but has declined to officially confirm his placement for security reasons. He is 71 or 72 years old. Stacy Peterson has never been found. If you like this video and have not subscribed yet, now is a great time to join. We post a new case every day, so hit subscribe and do not miss what is coming next. Corey Richens. On the night of March 4, 2022, a woman in Kamas, Utah, made her husband a Moscow Mule cocktail to celebrate a real estate deal she had just closed. He drank it, went to bed, and never woke up. The autopsy would later reveal that he had ingested fentanyl orally at approximately 5 times a lethal dose. Within a year, his wife had published a children's grief book about losing a parent. Within 2 years, she was charged with his death. This story does not start with the cocktail. It starts with debt. Forensic accountant Brooke Carrington testified at trial that by March 2022, Corey Richens owed approximately $7.5 million and needed to pay around $80,000 per month toward that debt. She had taken out roughly $2.2 million in life insurance policies on her husband Eric, several of which were allegedly obtained without his knowledge. Eric Richens was 39 years old, a father, and by all accounts, someone who had grown increasingly uneasy about his wife's financial behavior and had expressed that concern to close friends. Prosecutors also established that Corey had been carrying on a romantic relationship with a man named Robert Josh Grossman, who testified at trial. The defense, at one point, attempted to argue that Eric himself had been in a relationship with his best friend based on text messages. But the theory gained no traction with the jury. What nobody knew at the time was that this was not the first attempt. On Valentine's Day, February 14, 2022, Eric ate a sandwich Corey had prepared and told two friends he felt like he was going to die. He recovered. Prosecutors would later charge that incident as attempted aggravated murder. After Eric's death, Corey collected roughly $1.35 million in insurance payouts. She spent it within 3 months. In March 2023, she published a children's grief book titled, Are You With Me?, purportedly written with her sons. She promoted it on local television in April 2023. Trial evidence later showed she was not the actual author. Corey was arrested on May 8, 2023, and charged with aggravated murder and related counts by the Summit County Prosecutor's Office. She was denied bail twice by Judge Richard Mrazek, who cited the severity of the charges and evidence of potential witness tampering. In September 2023, a letter discovered in her jail cell, known as the Walk the Dog letter, allegedly outlined false testimony for her mother and brother to provide at trial. The discovery of that letter further complicated her defense. The trial was repeatedly delayed, and the Utah Supreme Court rejected a defense motion for a venue change in June 2025. The trial ran from February through March 2026 in Summit County. Lead prosecutor Brad Bloodworth presented the state's case, while defense attorney Wendy Lewis represented Richens. Bloodworth described the 911 call not as the sound of a wife losing her husband, but as the sound of a plan reaching its conclusion. The prosecution introduced cell phone search history that included queries about what constitutes a lethal dose of fentanyl and which prisons in the United States cater to wealthy inmates. Testimony from former housekeeper Carmen Lauber and drug dealer Robert Crozier laid out the chain of acquisition, though Crozier later partially contradicted his earlier statements about whether the substance was fentanyl or oxycodone. The defense rested without calling a single witness. The jury deliberated for under 3 hours and convicted on March 16, 2026, on aggravated murder, attempted aggravated murder, 2 counts of insurance fraud and forgery. On May 13, 2026, a date that would have been Eric's 44th birthday, Judge Mrazek sentenced Corey Richens to life without parole on the aggravated murder count, with consecutive terms on the remaining charges. Her defense team announced an appeal. As of May 2026, Corey Richens is in Utah Department of Corrections custody. The appeal is pending. Corey Richens took out millions in insurance on her husband, searched for lethal doses online, and then promoted a grief book on television. In the next case, the financial motive was smaller, but the investigation would stretch across years, span the San Francisco Bay, and become one of the most publicly followed cases in American criminal history. Scott Peterson. On Christmas Eve, 2002, a 27-year-old woman named Lacey Peterson disappeared from the home she shared with her husband Scott in Modesto, California. She was 8 months pregnant with a son they had planned to name Connor. Scott told police he had spent the day fishing alone at the Berkeley Marina on the San Francisco Bay. 4 months later, the remains of Lacey and Connor washed ashore on the eastern shoreline of the bay, near Richmond, close to where Scott had claimed to be fishing. Then, on January 24, 2003, a woman named Amber Frey held a press conference. Frey, a Fresno massage therapist, revealed that she had been dating Scott Peterson for roughly a month before Lacey vanished. He had told her he was single. After Lacey's disappearance, Modesto police asked Frey to record her phone calls with Scott, and those recordings became central evidence at trial. Scott Peterson was arrested on April 18, 2003, near a San Diego golf course. He had bleached his hair and grown a goatee, changing his appearance significantly. He was carrying approximately $15,000 in cash, multiple cell phones, and his brother's identification. Investigators had been surveilling him for weeks before the arrest, and the circumstances of the stop raised immediate questions about whether he had been preparing to flee the country. The trial was moved on a change of venue to San Mateo County because of the intense media coverage in the Modesto area. On November 12, 2004, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder of Lacey and second-degree murder of Connor. Lead prosecutor Rick DiStasso built the case around the circumstantial evidence, arguing that the location where the bodies washed ashore matched the area where Scott claimed to be fishing. Defense attorney Mark Garagos represented Peterson and argued the evidence was entirely circumstantial. On March 16, 2005, Peterson was sentenced to death. In August 2020, the California Supreme Court unanimously vacated the death sentence, finding that the trial judge had improperly dismissed prospective jurors who expressed opposition to the death penalty but said they could follow the law. The convictions themselves were upheld. On December 8, 2021, Judge Anne Christine Masulo resentenced Peterson to life without parole on the first-degree count, plus 15 years to life on the second-degree count, after Stanislaus County DA Birgit Fladiger opted not to seek a new death penalty trial at the family's request. A separate issue emerged around Juror 7, Rochelle Nice, who was accused of concealing her prior involvement as a crime victim during jury selection. In February 2022, Judge Elizabeth Hill found the false answers were unintentional and not prejudicial, and denied a new trial in December 2022. In January 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project took over Peterson's case, injecting new energy into a defense that had been largely dormant for years. They filed motions for DNA testing and pursued leads involving a burglary that occurred across the street from the Peterson home in December 2002, as well as a burned van found in Modesto around the same time. On August 4, 2025, they filed a new habeas petition with 14 separate claims, including actual innocence based on 3D Bay current modeling that allegedly showed the remains entered the water at Albany Bulb rather than Brooks Island, and a claim that Connor's estimated date of death was 4 to 12 days after Lacey's disappearance, which would undermine the prosecution's theory. On April 27, 2026, Judge Elizabeth Hill denied the entire petition in a 116-page ruling, finding that none of the evidence was actually new and that all claims were procedurally barred. The Innocence Project has announced plans to appeal. As of 2026, Scott Peterson remains incarcerated at Mule Creek State Prison in Amador County, California. His case remains active in the appellate courts. Scott Peterson maintained his innocence through a death sentence, a resentencing, and a denied habeas petition. In the next case, there was no mystery about who was responsible. The confession came within 48 hours. What made the case impossible to forget was the details of what happened inside the family home and at a remote oil well site in rural Colorado. Chris Watts. On the afternoon of August 13, 2018, a woman named Nicole Atkinson called the Frederick, Colorado police to report that her friend Shanann Watts was not responding to calls or texts and had missed a doctor's appointment. Atkinson had dropped Shanann off at the family home earlier that morning after a work trip. When officers arrived, Chris Watts, Shanann's husband, was there. The house was empty. Shanann's phone, purse, and medication were still inside. Their 2 young daughters were gone. Within hours, Chris Watts appeared on camera for local news stations, performing the role of a distressed husband pleading for his family's safe return. He looked into the camera and asked anyone with information to come forward. What nobody knew at the time was that the person standing in front of that camera had ended his family's lives in the early morning hours, before Atkinson even dropped Shanann off. In a later confession to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and Frederick police, Watts admitted he had strangled Shanann, who was 15 weeks pregnant with a son they planned to name Nico, and then smothered their 2 young daughters. He drove the bodies to CERV 319, an Anadarko petroleum oil well site outside Roggen, Colorado, buried Shanann in a shallow grave, and forced the children's bodies through 8-inch openings into crude oil storage tanks. The affair at the center of this case involved Nickel Kessinger, a geologist at Anadarko Petroleum. According to Watts' own statements to investigators, the relationship began in June 2018. Kessinger has said she was told Watts was already separated from his wife. She went to police voluntarily after the disappearances and was never charged. She has since changed her name and left public life. The investigation moved quickly. Watts failed a polygraph on August 15th, asked to speak to his father Ronnie, and partially confessed, initially claiming Shanann had harmed the children and he had acted in response. Police did not believe that version. He directed investigators to the CERV 319 site on August 16th, and the bodies were recovered. The contrast between the televised interviews, where Watts had appeared concerned and cooperative, and the reality of what he had done became one of the most studied examples of deceptive behavior in modern true crime analysis. Watts was initially charged with 9 felony counts, including 5 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body, and 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy. On November 6, 2018, he pleaded guilty to all 9 counts. The Weld County DA's office, under prosecutor Michael Rourke, took the death penalty off the table at the explicit request of Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Razuchek. The Razucheks attended every court hearing and addressed Watts directly at sentencing. On November 19, 2018, Weld County District Judge Marcelo Kopkow sentenced Watts to 3 consecutive life without parole terms for the 3 deaths, 2 concurrent life without parole terms, 48 years for unlawful termination of pregnancy, and 36 years for tampering. In February 2019, Watts gave a 5-hour follow-up interview to CBI, FBI, and Frederick police in which he admitted he had ended the children's lives intentionally, contradicting his original account. He also stated he had attempted to administer oxycodone to Shanann to terminate the pregnancy in the weeks before the events of August 13th. As of 2026, Chris Watts is incarcerated at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, under a security transfer. Wisconsin DOC records show 2 conduct reports, one in 2020 for unauthorized communications and one in 2021 for disobeying orders and possessing contraband. He has been corresponding with outside contacts and, according to media reports, has provided additional written confessions, including a claim that the planning went back weeks. Everything about the Watts case was public and fast. From the televised interviews to the guilty pleas 63 days after the crime. The next case was also fast, but it introduced a dynamic the legal system had rarely dealt with before. An adult in a position of authority at a school exploited that trust to manipulate a student into carrying out a plan that would end a life and become the first trial in American history broadcast from start to finish on live television. Pamela Smart. In the spring of 1990, a 22-year-old media coordinator at Winnicott High School in Hampton, New Hampshire, began an inappropriate relationship with a student she had met through a school drug awareness program. She was in a position of authority. The student was not. What followed was a betrayal of the trust placed in educators, and it ended with the death of her husband, Greg Smart, on May 1st, 1990. The student, along with 2 classmates and a driver, entered the Smart's dairy condominium that night. Greg Smart, 24, was shot once in the foyer. The scene was staged to look like a botched burglary. The investigation turned when a 16-year-old friend of the student, Cecilia Pierce, agreed to be wired by police. Pierce recorded Pamela Smart making incriminating statements about how the plan had been organized and carried out. Those recordings became the backbone of the prosecution. Pamela Smart's 1991 trial was the first in American history broadcast live on television from gavel to gavel, a fact documented by the New Hampshire Bar Association and confirmed by multiple national outlets. The media coverage was extraordinary. Cameras were in the courtroom for every witness, every exhibit, and every moment of cross-examination. The case generated the kind of public attention that had previously been reserved for celebrity trials. And it raised questions about pre-trial publicity that Smart's defense team would cite for decades. The jury convicted her of being an accomplice to first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and witness tampering. She was sentenced to mandatory life without parole. The student and a classmate pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received sentences of 28 years to life. Both were released on lifetime parole on June 4, 2015, after 25 years. The driver served approximately 15 years. A 4th participant served roughly 12 years. Every single person directly involved in the carrying out of the crime has been released from prison. Pamela Smart remains incarcerated, making her the only person still serving time in the case. All state appeals, including claims of ineffective assistance and pretrial publicity, were denied. A 2002 federal habeas petition was also rejected. In 2023, the New Hampshire Supreme Court dismissed her appeal of Governor Sununu's denial of a commutation hearing. In 2024, during a recorded statement at a prison writing workshop, Smart publicly accepted responsibility for her husband's death for the first time in over 30 years. Governor Kelly Ayotte rejected her latest commutation request on May 29, 2025, stating that those who commit violent crimes must be held accountable and that the request did not deserve a hearing before the Executive Council. On January 6, 2026, Smart's legal team, led by attorney Mark Sisti, filed a new federal habeas petition. It alleges that the jury transcripts of the wired recordings contain inserted, fabricated language that was not present in the original audio, that pretrial publicity tainted the verdict, that trial strategy forced an admission of guilt on one charge, and that life without parole for an accomplice is unconstitutional. That petition is currently pending before the federal court. The case left a lasting mark on American culture, Joyce Maynard's 1992 novel To Die For and the 1995 Gus Van Sant film starring Nicole Kidman were both based on the Smart case, further embedding it in the public consciousness. As of 2026, Pamela Smart is 58 years old and has been incarcerated since 1993 at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in Westchester County, New York. She has earned multiple advanced degrees, including a doctorate, and has been ordained as a minister while in custody. Her co-defendants have all been free for over a decade. Every person directly involved in the death of Greg Smart has been released from prison except the one who did not pull the trigger. Whether that constitutes justice or disproportion depends on where you stand. But in the final case, there was no ambiguity about who held the weapon. The evidence was forensic, the flight was immediate, and the defendant's own family still insists, to this day, that he is innocent. Neil Entwistle. On the morning of January 22, 2006, a British man living in Hopkinton, Massachusetts, purchased a one-way British Airways ticket from Boston Logan and boarded a flight to London at 8:15 a.m. His name was Neil Entwistle. He left behind his wife Rachel, a 27-year-old former teacher, and their infant daughter, both of whom had been found deceased in the master bedroom of their rented home. Both had been shot with a small caliber revolver. The bullet that struck the child passed through her body and into Rachel. The wound to Rachel's head was so small, it was not even detected until the full autopsy was completed. Investigators initially searched the home on January 21st and found nothing. It was not until a second search the following day that the bodies were discovered under bedding in the master bedroom. The gun was a .22 caliber Colt revolver owned by Rachel's stepfather, Joseph Matarazzo, and kept at the Matarazzo family home in Carver, Massachusetts. Forensic testing linked the weapon to both Rachel's DNA and Neil's DNA, and prosecutors argued Entwistle had traveled to Carver, retrieved it before the crime, and returned it to the Matarazzo home afterward. The motive, according to the prosecution led by Assistant DA Michael Fabry under DA Martha Coakley, was twofold. Entwistle was drowning in debt from a series of failed online business ventures, and investigators found extensive evidence of his use of escort and adult websites. At the time of his arrest in London, he was carrying a torn page from a tabloid advertising escort services. The financial picture was stark. The prosecution argued that Entwistle had run out of options. He could not sustain the life he and Rachel had built. He could not face the embarrassment of failure. And he chose to end his family's lives rather than confront the reality of what he had become. On February 9, 2006, Metropolitan Police arrested Entwistle on a London Underground train at Royal Oak Station. He was extradited to the United States on February 15th and arraigned at Framingham District Court. The arrest in London, nearly 3 weeks after the crime, drew significant media attention on both sides of the Atlantic. The trial took place in June 2008 at Middlesex County Superior Court in Woburn, before Judge Diane Kottmeyer. Defense attorney Elliot Weinstein represented Entwistle and presented a theory that Rachel had taken her own life and the child's life before Neil fled. The prosecution dismantled that theory through forensic evidence showing the angles and trajectories of the shots were inconsistent with a self-inflicted scenario. On June 25, 2008, the jury convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder plus firearms and ammunition charges. Judge Kottmeyer sentenced him to mandatory life without parole on each count, with 10 years of probation on the firearms charges, and imposed the explicit condition that Entwistle never profit from his story. In her remarks, the judge called the crimes incomprehensible. Entwistle's appeals followed a predictable path. In August 2012, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court rejected his claims regarding the warrantless search and jury impartiality. In January 2013, the United States Supreme Court declined to hear the case. A further petition to the SJC in August 2014 was also unsuccessful. Prison has not been uneventful. Shortly after his initial placement at Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center, Entwistle was tricked by a white supremacist prison gang into shaving his head, after which they threatened to take his life. He was placed in administrative segregation and transferred in December 2008 to Old Colony Correctional Center, a medium security facility in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. As of 2026, Neil Entwistle remains incarcerated at Old Colony Correctional Center. His parents, Clifford and Yvonne Entwistle, continue to publicly maintain that their son is innocent and have suggested Rachel was responsible. In every one of these 10 cases, the affair was the accelerant, not the cause. The cause was always something more ordinary: debt, desperation, the belief that a life could be erased and a new one started in its place. None of them succeeded. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.